The blizzard was coming. Eli Walker could smell it in the air, that peculiar metallic scent that preceded every great storm in the Montana Badlands. He'd seen 50 winters in these hills, and his bones had learned to read weather better than any almanac. But it wasn't the weather that troubled him that evening. It was old Ash. The gray gelding stood at the fence line, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. Ash was 23 years old, a Spanish Mustang mix with a coat the color of winter smoke and a white blaze down his face that looked like a lightning strike. His left hip bore 3 brands from 3 different owners, a constellation of old cruelties burned into horsehide. The latest scar, a crude CR for Clearwater Ridge, was Eli's own doing, though he'd done it quick and shallow, more out of legal necessity than desire to mark the old horse. Ash had been with Clearwater Ridge for 5 years, quiet and reliable, content to spend his twilight years carrying supplies between the main ranch and the line shacks. He'd earned his keep and then some. But tonight, something had changed. "What is it, old man?" Eli muttered, approaching the fence with his rifle slung over his shoulder. The ranch hands had already retreated to the bunkhouse, securing the livestock before the storm hit. Only Eli remained outside, drawn by the horse's unusual behavior. Ash turned to look at him, and Eli felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. In all his years working with horses, he'd learned to read their eyes. Most folk thought horses were dumb animals, but Eli knew better. Horses remembered things, people, places, pain. Their eyes held stories if you knew how to listen. And Ash's eyes were screaming. The old gelding suddenly reared, hooves pawing air, then crashed back down and lunged at the fence. The top rail splintered under his weight. Before Eli could react, Ash was through, galloping into the gathering dusk with a speed that defied his age. "Damn fool horse," Eli shouted, but he was already moving toward the stable. Whatever had spooked Ash, it wasn't right. The old Mustang wasn't prone to panic. In 5 years, he'd been the steadiest mount on the ranch, unfazed by rattlesnakes, gunfire, or summer lightning. Eli saddled his own mount, a young bay named Copper, and followed Ash's tracks into the wilderness. The temperature was dropping fast, and the first flakes of snow were beginning to fall, fat, heavy flakes that promised a long, brutal night. The trail led northeast, away from the ranch and into the broken country where the grasslands gave way to eroded gullies and wind-carved stone. This was old Sioux territory, land that had seen more blood than rain. Eli pushed Copper hard, following the fresh hoofprints through the failing light. He found Ash 3 miles out, standing beneath a massive cottonwood tree that rose from the center of a dry wash like a skeletal hand reaching for heaven. The tree was ancient and half-dead, its bare branches twisted by decades of wind. And hanging from one of those branches, silhouetted against the darkening sky, was a human figure. Eli's hand went to his rifle, but Ash's behavior stopped him. The old horse wasn't agitated anymore. He stood perfectly still beneath the tree, looking up at the hanging body with something that looked disturbingly like recognition. Eli dismounted slowly, his boots crunching in the frozen grass. As he approached, he could see that the figure was still alive, barely. It was a woman, suspended by her wrist from a rope thrown over the branch, her toes just brushing the ground. Her head hung forward, dark hair obscuring her face, and her clothes were torn and bloody. "Jesus Christ," Eli breathed. He pulled his knife and cut her down, catching her as she fell. She was light, emaciated, her skin cold as marble. For a moment he thought she was dead, but then she gasped, a terrible, rattling sound. Ash moved closer, lowering his head to the woman's face. His breath created small clouds of vapor in the freezing air. Then he did something Eli had never seen a horse do. He whinnied, low and mournful, almost like a human sob. The woman's eyes flickered open. They were gray, the color of storm clouds, and despite her condition, they were sharp with intelligence and pain. She looked at the horse, and her cracked lips moved. "Ash," she whispered. "Old Ash." Then she passed out. Eli stared at the unconscious woman, then at the horse. "You know her," he said quietly. "Don't you, old man?" Ash stamped his hoof once, twice. Then he knelt, something Eli had never taught him, never seen him do. The message was clear: load her up. We're going home. The blizzard hit in full force as they made their way back to Clearwater Ridge. Eli had lashed the woman to Ash's back, and the old gelding moved with careful, deliberate steps through the deepening snow, as though he carried precious cargo. Copper followed behind, riderless, with Eli walking between them to break the worst of the wind. By the time they reached the ranch, visibility had dropped to near zero. Eli carried the woman into his own cabin rather than the main house. This situation felt private, personal, dangerous in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He laid her on his bed and began the work of saving her life. She'd been badly beaten, that much was clear. Bruises covered her ribs, and her wrists were raw from the rope. But the worst injuries were less visible, the signs of prolonged exposure, dehydration, starvation. Whoever had strung her up had meant for her to die slowly. Eli cleaned her wounds, forced water between her lips, wrapped her in every blanket he owned. Then he went back outside to tend to Ash. The old horse stood in the lee of the barn, refusing to enter his stall. Snow had accumulated on his back, but he seemed oblivious to it, his attention fixed on the cabin where the woman lay. "She's alive," Eli told him, brushing snow from the gray coat. "Barely, but alive. Now you gonna tell me what this is about?" Ash turned to look at him with those ancient, knowing eyes. And for the first time in his life, Eli Walker wished that horses could talk. The woman woke 3 days later, during a brief pause in the storm. Eli was dozing in his chair by the fire when he heard her stir. He sat up to find her staring at him with those penetrating gray eyes. "Where am I?" Her voice was rough, damaged. "Clearwater Ridge. My name's Eli Walker. You're safe." "Safe?" She laughed, a bitter sound. "There's no such place." "Maybe not," Eli agreed. "But you're alive, which is more than whoever strung you up intended." She was silent for a long moment, her gaze moving around the cabin, cataloging exits and weapons with the automatic vigilance of someone who'd lived too long in danger. "The horse," she said finally. "The gray one. Where is he?" "In the barn. Been standing watch outside this cabin for 3 days straight. Won't eat, won't rest. Just waits." Eli leaned forward. "You called him by name. Ash. How do you know him?" The woman closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were wet. "I knew him before. Before he was Ash. Before he was anyone's property." She paused, struggling with something. "My name is Ruby Shaw, and if you're smart, you'll put me back out in that snow before they come looking." "Who's they?" "The people who want to make sure certain experiments stay buried." Ruby sat up slowly, wincing at the movement. "The people who believe animals are just machines that need to be properly calibrated." Eli felt a cold hand grip his spine. "You're talking about the Iron Brand operation." Ruby's head snapped toward him. "How do you know that name?" "Rumors. Stories from cavalry men passing through. Talk of horses being changed, made into something else." He shook his head. "Figured it was tall tales. Campfire nonsense." "It's not nonsense." Ruby swung her legs over the side of the bed, though the effort clearly cost her. "It's real, and it's worse than any rumor you've heard." She looked toward the door, as though she could see through it to where Ash waited. "That horse saved my life twice now. Once, when I set him free from a transport heading to the modification facility. And now, when he found me dying." "Modification facility," Eli repeated. "What exactly were they modifying?" Ruby met his eyes. "Everything that makes a horse. Pain response, fear instinct, individual will." Her hands clenched into fists. They were turning them into machines. Perfect, obedient, expendable machines for the mines and the wars and the factories. And I helped them do it. Over the next few days, as Ruby's strength slowly returned, she told Eli the whole story. How she'd been recruited by the army as a horse trainer, one of the best in the Western Territories. How her skill at reading horses, at communicating with them, had been twisted into something monstrous. The Iron Brand project had started small, an experimental program designed to create better cavalry mounts. The theory was simple. Horses spooked in battle, felt pain, grew tired, rebelled. But what if you could eliminate those weaknesses? What if you could create a horse that felt no fear, no pain, no exhaustion? The scientists, and Ruby spat the word like a curse, had developed a combination of surgical procedures and chemical treatments. Targeted nerve ablation to eliminate pain receptors. Drug cocktails to suppress fear responses. Behavioral conditioning so severe it broke an animal's will entirely. They called it optimization, Ruby said bitterly. Making animals more efficient. More useful. She stared into the fire. I watched them cut into living horses, removing parts of their brains. I watched them pump chemicals into veins until the horse's eyes went dead. And for a while, God help me, I told myself it was progress. What changed? Eli asked quietly. Ghost, Ruby whispered. His name was Ghost. Ghost had been a black stallion, 17 hands high, with a coat like polished obsidian and a white star on his forehead. Ruby had trained him from a yearling, and he'd been perfect, powerful, intelligent, brave. The kind of horse that came along once in a lifetime. The army had wanted Ghost for the program. Ruby had refused. Ghost was too valuable, she'd argued, too exceptional to risk on experimental procedures. But her objections had been overruled. The commanding officer had pointed out that Ghost's exceptional qualities were exactly why he was the perfect test subject. They promised it would be different with him, Ruby said, her voice hollow. Refined techniques. Minimal intervention. They said he'd come back better. Stronger. She laughed bitterly. I actually believed them. The surgery had taken 8 hours. When Ghost emerged, he was alive but transformed. His eyes, once bright with intelligence and personality, were flat and empty. He responded to commands with mechanical precision but showed no initiative, no spirit. When Ruby approached him, calling his name, he looked through her as though she were invisible. That's when I understood, Ruby said. They hadn't made him better. They'd killed who he was and left the body walking around. He was a ghost in truth, the shell of what he'd been. Ruby had stolen records documenting the entire program, surgical notes, chemical formulas, financial ledgers showing which industrialists were funding the research. She'd meant to expose it all, to bring down everyone involved. But before she could, they'd discovered the theft. The manhunt had been brutal. Ruby had gone underground, hiding in the roughest territories of the Montana Badlands. She'd managed to free a transport of horses scheduled for modification, including a gray Mustang with lightning bolt markings and 2 mini brands. That had been Ash, 5 years ago. I told him to run, Ruby said softly, to go as far as his legs would carry him. I never expected to see him again. She shook her head in wonder. But he found me. Somehow, he knew I needed help, and he found me. Horses remember, Eli said. Better than people, sometimes. They do. Ruby stood, moving to the window. Outside, fresh snow was falling, covering the world in white. Which is why the Iron Brand program is more dangerous than you realize. The horses they've modified, they still remember who they were, what they were, but they can't access those memories anymore. Can't act on them. Her breath fogged the glass. Do you understand what that means? They're prisoners in their own bodies. Conscious, but unable to control themselves. It's torture. Permanent, living torture. Eli felt sick. How many? When I left, 47 had been through the full modification process. Hundreds more were in various stages. Ruby turned to face him. And they were preparing to scale up. Sell the technique to mining companies, to the railroad, to anyone who wanted an animal that would work until it literally dropped dead without complaint. Jesus Christ. The man behind it all is named Silas Vance, Ruby continued. Industrial magnate. Owns half the copper mines in Montana. He sees animals as equipment, less valuable than a steam engine, more disposable than a mule. He funded the entire program. Her jaw tightened. And he's the one who gave the order to have me killed. The people who hung you. Vance's men. They caught me a week ago, up near the Canadian border. I'd been working as a stable hand under a fake name, trying to disappear. She touched her throat, where bruises still darkened the skin. They wanted to know what I'd done with the records. When I wouldn't tell them, they decided to make an example of me. Eli was quiet for a long moment. Where are the records now? Hidden. In a place they'll never look. Ruby met his eyes. Which is why I need to leave. Soon. Before they track me here and bring their war to your doorstep. Might be they already have, Eli said slowly. 3 days ago, 2 men came by. Said they were looking for a woman who'd stolen from them. Claimed she was dangerous, possibly armed. Asked if I'd seen any strangers. Ruby's face went pale. What did you tell them? Told them I hadn't seen anyone but my own hands in weeks. Eli stood, moving to the gun cabinet. Also told them that anyone coming onto Clearwater Ridge uninvited was likely to catch a bullet. They left. He pulled out his Winchester, checking the action. But they'll be back. Men like that always come back. Then I need to go. Now. Tonight. In this weather? Eli gestured to the window, where the snow was falling harder now. You'd be dead in an hour. Better dead in the snow than leading them to you. Too late for that, I reckon. Eli handed her a revolver. Besides, old Ash would never forgive me if I let you walk out into a blizzard. He smiled grimly. That horse has gone through too much trouble to save your life. Least we can do is not waste his effort. Despite everything, Ruby laughed, a real laugh this time, not bitter or hollow. You talk about him like he's human. Maybe humans just aren't as different from horses as we like to think, Eli said. We both remember. We both grieve. We both fight when we're cornered. He loaded the rifle. And we both know the difference between what's right and what's easy. Ruby checked the cylinder of the revolver, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. The records I stole. They're in an old silver mine, about 20 miles north of here. Place called Dead Man's Gulch. I know it. Played out 15 years ago. There's a false wall in the deepest tunnel. Behind it, I hid everything. Notes, photographs, financial records. Enough to expose not just Vance, but every officer and official who made the Iron Brand program possible. She looked at him steadily. If something happens to me, someone needs to know where they are. Nothing's going to happen to you, Eli said firmly. We'll ride this storm out, then figure out our next move. But even as he spoke, they both heard it, the sound of horses approaching through the snow. They came at dawn, when the storm had finally broken and the world was buried under 2 feet of fresh snow. Eli spotted them from the cabin window, 6 riders, moving in a tactical formation that spoke of military training. They wore heavy coats, but he could see the glint of weapons beneath. They're here, he said quietly. Ruby was already moving, checking her weapons, pulling on the spare coat Eli had given her. How many? 6 that I can see. Likely more hanging back. Vance doesn't do anything small. She moved to the window, peering out carefully. He'll have surrounded the property by now. Eli didn't doubt it. He'd dealt with enough range wars and cattle rustlers to recognize a professional operation when he saw one. These weren't random hired guns. They were soldiers or ex-soldiers, moving with discipline and purpose. Outside, in the barn, Ash began to scream. It was a sound Eli had heard before, during his younger years when he'd ridden with the cavalry in the Apache Wars. It was the sound a horse made when it sensed danger, not the whinny of fear, but the war cry of a Mustang defending its herd. The riders stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, one man riding forward alone. He was tall and lean, with a face like carved granite and eyes the color of ice. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly in the cold morning air. Ruby Shaw, we know you're in there. Come out peacefully, and no one else needs to get hurt. Eli opened the door, rifle in hand. You're on private property. Best turn around and ride out before someone does get hurt. The man's expression didn't change. This doesn't concern you, old-timer. We're here for the woman. Hand her over, and we'll leave. Can't hand over what I don't have, Eli said evenly. Don't play games. We tracked her here. We know she's inside. The man's hand moved toward his coat. Mr. Vance is willing to be generous. There's $1,000 for you if you step aside. Or we can do this the hard way. Generous. Eli spat in the snow. That what you call it when you string a woman up to die in the cold? The man shrugged. She stole valuable property. Mr. Vance wants it back. The only property I see here is this land, and it's mine. Eli raised the rifle slightly. Now you've got about 10 seconds to get off it before I start shooting. The man smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. We were hoping you'd say that. He raised his hand, and the other 5 riders spread out, taking positions around the cabin. Eli could see more men emerging from the tree line now, at least a dozen, maybe more. He was outnumbered and outgunned, and they both knew it. But before anyone could make a move, something unexpected happened. Ash burst from the barn, moving faster than any horse his age had a right to move. He charged directly at the lead rider, ears pinned back, teeth bared. The man's horse reared in panic, throwing its rider into the snow. Ash didn't slow. He wheeled and charged at the next rider, scattering the formation. Shoot that damn animal, someone shouted. But their horses were panicking now, spooked by Ash's fury. Shots rang out, bullets kicking up snow, but Ash was moving too fast, weaving between the riders with the agility of a cutting horse working cattle. Eli used the confusion to drop the nearest man with a rifle shot, then dove back inside the cabin as return fire shredded the doorframe. Ruby was at the back window, firing carefully, each shot counting. 2 more men went down. Outside, Ash continued his assault. He'd spent years working cattle, learning to read movement, to anticipate. He used those skills now, driving the attackers' horses into each other, creating chaos in their ranks. An old Mustang fighting for his herd. But there were too many. Eli heard the distinctive crack of a Winchester, saw Ash stumble. Blood stained the snow beneath him. Not a killing shot, but painful. The old horse recovered, but he was limping now, favoring his left foreleg. "They're going to kill him," Ruby said, her voice tight with anguish. "Not if we kill them first." Eli reloaded, taking careful aim. "There's a root cellar with a tunnel leading to the barn. You remember how to handle a horse in combat." Ruby's smile was fierce, like riding a bicycle. They fought their way to the cellar, Eli laying down covering fire while Ruby descended the ladder. The tunnel was narrow and dark, but it led straight to the barn as promised. They emerged among the nervous horses, all of them stamping and whinnying at the gunfire outside. Ash was there, bleeding and exhausted, but his eyes lit up when he saw Ruby. She ran to him, pressing her face against his neck. "You brave, stubborn old fool," she whispered. "You beautiful, stupid, wonderful horse." Ash nickered softly, and for a moment it was like the years fell away. She was a young trainer again, and he was a wild Mustang who'd chosen to trust her. Before the experiments, before the pain, before everything that had broken them both. "We need to move," Eli said, already saddling Copper. "There's a canyon about a mile east. Rocky ground, hard to track. If we can make it there." "No," Ruby said, still holding Ash. "Running just delays the inevitable. Vance won't stop. Not until I'm dead, or he has those records." She looked up at Eli, her eyes hard with resolve. "It's time to stop running. Time to finish this." "Against 12 men? That's suicide." "Maybe, but at least it'll be on my terms." She began to saddle Ash, moving with swift efficiency despite the old horse's injury. "Besides, we're not going after all of them. Just one. Vance. He's careful, but he's arrogant. He'll have stayed back, somewhere he can observe without risking himself." She swung into the saddle, and Ash shifted beneath her, ready to spite his wound. "The dead mine. The one where I hid the records. That's where he'll be. That's where he'd set up a command post." Eli stared at her. "That's 20 miles. Through hostile territory. With you injured, and that horse bleeding. You got a better plan?" He didn't. And the way she sat on that old gray horse, shoulders back, eyes forward, she looked like a cavalry officer riding into battle. Like someone who'd already accepted death and found freedom in the acceptance. "Hell with it," Eli muttered, checking his weapons. "I'm too old to die in bed anyway." They rode out through a gap in the barn's back wall, staying low as bullets whined overhead. Behind them, the cabin was taking heavy fire, but the attackers thought their targets were still inside. By the time they realized the truth, Ruby and Eli were already disappearing into the broken country beyond Clearwater Ridge. Ash ran despite his wound, his gait uneven but determined. Ruby leaned low over his neck, whispering encouragement, and the old horse responded as though he understood every word. Maybe he did. Horses understood more than most people gave them credit for. They rode hard for 2 hours, pushing through deep snow and across frozen streams. Eli kept expecting pursuit, but none came. Either Vance's men were still searching the ranch, or they'd fallen for the decoy. Ruby had convinced Eli to set a false trail leading west, toward the Canadian border. With luck, the bulk of Vance's forces would follow it, giving them time to reach Dead Man's Gulch. It was a desperate gamble, but desperation was all they had left. The sun was high when they finally saw it. The old mine entrance, a dark wound in the side of a snow-covered hill. The surrounding area was littered with the debris of abandoned industry, rusted equipment, collapsed sheds, a skeletal water tower. This had once been a thriving operation, before the silver played out and the company pulled up stakes. Now it was a ghost town in the truest sense. Empty, forgotten, haunted by the memories of men who died in the dark seeking fortune. "There," Ruby said, pointing to fresh tracks in the snow. "At least 6 horses. Maybe more. Your friend Vance would bet my life on it." She dismounted carefully, helping Ash shift his weight off the injured leg. The wound had stopped bleeding, but the old horse was exhausted. "You've done enough," she told him softly. "Rest now. Let me finish this." But Ash tossed his head, stamping his good hoof. His message was clear. Where she went, he went. Eli checked his rifle. Stubborn as a damn mule. Stubbornness is what keeps us alive, Ruby said. She pulled a small revolver from her boot, checked the cylinder, then looked at Eli. Whatever happens in there, thank you. For everything. Save your thanks. We're not dead yet. They approached the mine entrance carefully, weapons ready. The tracks led inside, disappearing into the darkness beyond. Eli lit a lantern, the flame casting long shadows on the rough-cut stone walls. The mine went deep, tunnels branching off in multiple directions. But Ruby moved with certainty, taking lefts and rights without hesitation. She knew this place. She'd hidden here before, studied its layout, made it her sanctuary. The records are in the deepest shaft, she whispered. Almost a quarter-mile down. There's a false wall, looks like a cave-in, but behind it is a small chamber where the miners used to store dynamite. And Vance knows about this place? He knows I came here. Probably figured it out when his men found the transport horses I freed wandering nearby. Her jaw tightened. He's looking for the records. Probably his men tearing the mine apart right now. They moved deeper, the air growing colder and staler. The sounds of the outside world faded, replaced by the drip of water and the echo of their own breathing. Behind them, Ash followed, his hoofbeats oddly muffled in the confined space. Then they heard voices. Eli doused the lantern immediately. In the darkness, the voices became clearer, men talking, the scrape of tools against stone. Ruby touched Eli's arm, guiding him forward by touch alone. Years of working with horses had taught her to navigate in darkness, to trust senses other than sight. They rounded a corner and saw light ahead, lamplight, illuminating a natural cavern where the mine shaft opened up. And there, supervising a crew of men tearing apart a stone wall, was Silas Vance. He was younger than Eli expected, maybe 40, with the kind of lean, hungry look that came from never being satisfied. He wore expensive clothes impractical for mine work and held a silver-headed cane that probably concealed a blade or gun. His men worked with the desperate energy of people afraid of disappointing him. Carefully, Vance was saying, "The documents are fragile. I want them intact." Ruby stepped into the light, her gun raised. Looking for something? Vance turned slowly, and his face split into a cold smile. "Ruby Shaw, I was wondering when you'd make an appearance." "Call off your dogs," Ruby said. "This is between us." "I'm afraid that's not how this works." Vance gestured, and men appeared from the shadows, at least 8 of them, all armed. "You're outgunned, Miss Shaw." "Again. You'd think you'd learn." "I've learned plenty." Ruby's gun didn't waver. "I learned that men like you see everything as property, resources to be exploited. You don't see animals as living things. You see them as machines that need to be optimized." "And what's wrong with that?" Vance asked, genuinely curious. "We optimize everything else. We improve crops, refine metals, enhance machinery. Why should animals be different?" "Because they're not machines," Ruby said quietly. "They feel. They remember. They suffer. Sentiment." Vance waved his hand dismissively. "The luxury of those who've never had to build anything. Do you know how many men die in mines every year, Miss Shaw? Hundreds. Thousands. Because they get tired, they make mistakes, they panic. But a properly modified horse? It works until it drops. No complaints. No strikes. No demands for better conditions." He smiled. "It's the future. Efficient. Clean. Profitable. It's torture. It's progress." Vance's smile faded. "And you won't stop it. Even if you destroy those records, I have copies. I have the procedures memorized. The Iron Brand program will continue, with or without documentation." "Maybe," Ruby said. "But without proof, you're just another madman with a theory. Those records have names, dates, financial transactions. They prove that army officers took bribes, that politicians looked the other way, that respectable businessmen funded torture." She took a step forward. "You can kill me, but those records are already on their way to newspapers in Chicago, New York, San Francisco. By next week, everyone will know what you've done." It was a bluff. The records were still behind that false wall, exactly where she'd left them. But Vance didn't know that. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. "You're lying." "Am I?" Ruby smiled. "You want to bet your empire on it?" The standoff stretched, taut as a wire. Vance's men looked to him for orders, fingers on triggers. Eli had his rifle trained on Vance, knowing he'd get one shot before they all died. Behind them, in the tunnel, Ash waited in darkness, breathing quietly. Then Vance laughed, a genuine sound of amusement. You almost had me. But I know you too well, Ruby. You're too sentimental. You wouldn't have trusted those records to anyone else. He gestured to his men. Kill them. Then tear this mine apart until you find what we came for. The men raised their weapons. And Ash charged. The old gray horse exploded from the tunnel like a cavalry mount hitting enemy lines. His injured leg barely slowed him as he crashed into Vance's men, scattering them like bowling pins. Shots rang out, bullets ricocheting off stone, but Ash was among them now, kicking and biting with the fury of a wild Mustang. Eli and Ruby used the chaos to their advantage, firing carefully into the confusion. Men went down screaming. Others fled into the darkness of the mine tunnels, their lanterns creating a disorienting dance of light and shadow. Vance himself had fallen backward, losing his cane in the melee. He scrambled toward a side tunnel, but Ash cut him off, teeth bared, ears pinned back. The old horse looked like something from a nightmare, blood-stained, eyes rolling, ready to kill. Call him off. Vance screamed at Ruby. For God's sake, call him off. Ruby approached slowly, her gun trained on Vance. He's not mine to command. He makes his own choices. She knelt beside Vance, pressing the barrel of her revolver against his forehead. Just like those horses you tortured. They should have had choices too. They're animals. Vance spat. They don't think, they don't feel. They remember, Ruby interrupted. That's what you never understood. Every horse that went through your program, every animal you cut and drugged and broke, they remember what they were before. They remember freedom, joy, will. Her finger tightened on the trigger. And they remember you. Behind her, Ash stamped his hooves, and in that sound Ruby heard all the pain and rage of every modified horse, every broken spirit crying out for justice. But she didn't pull the trigger. You're not worth the bullet, she said, standing up. And I'm not you. I don't believe in turning living things into machines. She gestured with the gun. Get up. You're going to help me retrieve those records. Then you're going to accompany me to the nearest federal marshal. And you're going to confess everything. Vance laughed bitterly. And if I refuse? Ruby smiled, cold and hard. Then I leave you here with Ash. Let's see how long you last against a horse that remembers. They found the records exactly where Ruby had left them, behind a false wall that had been cleverly disguised as a cave-in. Vance's men had walked past it dozens of times without noticing. It took Ruby less than 5 minutes to locate the hidden latch and swing the wall aside, revealing a small chamber beyond. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and protected from moisture, were stacks of documents. Medical records, chemical formulas, detailed notes describing surgical procedures, photographs that made Eli's stomach turn, horses strapped to tables, skulls opened, brains exposed, and financial ledgers showing exactly how much each optimization cost and who had funded it. Dear God, Eli whispered, looking through the papers by lamplight. This is systematic torture. Industrial-scale cruelty, Ruby agreed, carefully gathering the documents. 37 horses died during the initial trials. Another 20 were so damaged they had to be destroyed. The ones that survived. She paused, her hands shaking slightly. They're alive, but they're not living. Just breathing machines, performing tasks until their bodies give out. Vance, held at gunpoint by Eli, watched with cold eyes. You see waste. I see progress. Those horses served a purpose. Contributed to advancement. They had names, Ruby said quietly. Phantom, Starlight, Thunder, Ghost. Her voice caught on the last name. They were individuals. And you took that from them. Sentiment is a luxury we can't afford in the modern age, Vance said. The world is changing, Miss Shaw. Those who adapt will thrive. Those who cling to outdated notions of animal welfare will be left behind. Then leave me behind, Ruby said. I'll take that over becoming whatever you are. They were preparing to leave when they heard it, a sound that made even Vance pause. It was distant, echoing through the mine tunnels, but unmistakable, hoofbeats. Not the uneven gait of an injured horse like Ash, but the perfectly synchronized cadence of multiple animals moving in formation. What is that? Eli asked, raising his rifle. Vance smiled, and there was something terrible in that expression. That, Mr. Walker, is the future arriving. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer. Then they appeared at the entrance to the cavern. Horses, but unlike any Eli had seen before. There were 6 of them, moving in perfect unison, their steps synchronized like soldiers on parade. They wore strange harnesses of leather and metal, and plates of iron armor covered their chests and flanks. But it was their eyes that made Eli's blood run cold. Empty, flat, dead. Iron horses, Ruby breathed, and there was horror in her voice. The final stage of the program. The horses stopped at the cavern entrance, arrayed in a line. They showed no reaction to the blood, the bodies of Vance's fallen men, the chaos of the recent fight. They simply stood, waiting for orders with inhuman patience. And then a 7th horse appeared, stepping forward from the ranks. It was massive, at least 18 hands high, with a coat so black it seemed to absorb light. Iron plates covered its legs and barrel, bolted directly into flesh and bone. Its head was encased in an articulated metal mask that left only its eyes and nostrils exposed. Those eyes. Ghost, Ruby whispered. The great black stallion stood perfectly still, and in his remaining eye, one had been removed, replaced with a glass lens of some kind. Ruby saw nothing. No recognition. No awareness. Just the mechanical patience of a machine waiting to be activated. Beautiful, isn't he? Vance said, his voice filled with pride. The culmination of 3 years' work. Stronger than any natural horse. Faster. Completely fearless. Impervious to pain. He can work for 72 hours straight without rest. He'll charge into fire, machine gun fire, anything we command. He smiled at Ruby's expression. And yes, he was your ghost once. But you should thank me. I've made him perfect. Ruby was shaking, her gun lowering. You monster. You absolute monster. I'm a visionary. Vance stepped forward, emboldened by the arrival of his modified horses. And you've lost, Miss Shaw. Even if you kill me, even if you destroy these records, the knowledge exists. The techniques can be replicated. What we've started here will transform the world. Not if I burn every shred of documentation, Ruby said, raising her gun again. Not if I make sure no one can ever repeat what you've done. Then you'll have to kill Ghost too. Vance's smile widened. Because he's the living proof of concept. His mere existence proves the Iron Brand works. And somehow, I don't think you have it in you to destroy him. Not when he was once your beloved companion. It was a cruel calculation, but accurate. Ruby stared at the massive black horse, and her hands trembled. This thing wearing Ghost's body. It wore iron plates bolted through skin, bore scars from invasive surgery, moved with the soulless precision of a machine. But somewhere beneath the modification, beneath the torture and transformation, was there anything left of the horse she'd loved? Ghost, she called softly. Boy, do you remember me? The black horse didn't react. Didn't even twitch an ear. He can't hear you, Vance said. Not in any meaningful way. The part of his brain that processed emotional bonds was removed. He responds to commands, nothing more. Ruby's face was wet with tears now. You killed him. You killed him and left the body walking around. I optimized him. There's a difference. Ash suddenly moved, limping forward despite his wound. He approached Ghost slowly, carefully, the way horses approach each other in a field, extending his nose, making soft sounds. Ghost stood motionless, showing no response. But then something happened. Ash nickered again, a specific pattern of sounds. And Ghost's ear twitched. Just once, just slightly. But it was there, a flicker of something beneath the programming. Impossible, Vance muttered. The social recognition centers were completely ablated. Ash called again, louder, more insistent. And this time, Ghost took a step forward. His movements were no longer mechanical. They were uncertain, almost confused, as though some deeply buried part of his consciousness was stirring. Ruby held her breath, hope warring with despair. Ghost, can you hear him? Can you remember? The black stallion's head lowered slightly. His remaining eye focused on Ash, and for just a moment, just a heartbeat, something flickered there. Recognition? Memory? Or just a ghost of who he'd been, trapped in a machine body? Then Vance pulled a silver whistle from his pocket and blew a single sharp note. Ghost's head snapped up. His eye went flat and dead again. He turned, moving back into formation with the other iron horses. All trace of individuality vanished. Neural override, Vance explained calmly. A frequency that triggers complete obedience. quite useful for controlling modified animals. He blew the whistle again, a different pattern, and the horses began to advance into the cavern. Kill them. All of them. The iron horses moved forward, their iron-shod hooves striking the stone floor in perfect unison. They showed no hesitation, no fear, no mercy. They were machines programmed to destroy, and they would execute that programming with absolute efficiency. Eli fired, but his bullets struck iron armor and ricocheted harmlessly. Ruby tried to aim for the eyes, the exposed parts, but the horses were moving too fast, too coordinated. They'd been trained for combat, designed to be unstoppable. Ash positioned himself between Ruby and the advancing horses, despite his wound, despite his age. He reared up, striking out with his hooves, trying to defend her the only way he knew how. But he was one old Mustang against 6 war machines. The first iron horse struck him, and Ash went down hard. No! Ruby screamed, trying to reach him, but Eli grabbed her, pulling her back as the modified horses closed in. They were cornered, trapped against the cavern wall with nowhere to run. This was it, Ruby realized. This was how it ended. Killed by the very thing she'd tried to stop, destroyed by her own failure to protect the animals she'd sworn to defend. But then Ghost stopped. The great black stallion halted mid-step, his head turning toward where Ash lay bleeding on the ground. The other iron horses continued their advance, but Ghost stood perfectly still, as though something in his programming had encountered an error. Vance blew the whistle again, harder, more insistent. Kill them. I command you. Ghost didn't move. His head lowered, and he made a sound. A low, rumbling call that Ruby had heard once before, years ago, when Ghost had been a young stallion claiming a territory as his own. It was a challenge. A declaration. What's happening? Vance demanded, blowing the whistle again. Why isn't he responding? Because you were wrong, Ruby said quietly. You can cut out parts of his brain, you can pump him full of drugs, you can cover him in iron. But you can't kill what makes him a horse. You can only bury it. And Ash just woke it up. Ghost turned, and now he was facing the other iron horses. His brothers in suffering. The ones still trapped in mechanical obedience. And he screamed. It was a war cry, a rebel yell, the sound of every tortured animal breaking free from its chains. The other iron horses faltered, their perfect formation breaking as something deep in their modified brains responded to that primal call. Ghost charged, not at Ruby and Eli, but at Vance. The industrialist barely had time to scream before 2 tons of armored horse hit him. The silver whistle flew from his hand, clattering across the stone floor. Ghost reared up, his iron-shod hooves coming down like hammers, again and again, until Vance stopped moving. The other iron horses stood motionless, their programming broken, their dead eyes flickering with something that might have been confusion or might have been the first stirrings of consciousness returning. Ruby moved carefully toward Ghost, who stood over Vance's body, sides heaving. Blood dripped from his armor, and she couldn't tell if it was his or Vance's. Probably both. Ghost, she said softly. Easy, boy. Easy. The great black stallion turned to look at her, and in his remaining eye, she saw something impossible. He knew her. Despite everything they'd done to him, despite the surgery and the drugs and the torture, some part of Ghost remained. Buried deep, damaged beyond repair, but there. Still there. She reached out slowly, placing her hand on his armored neck. Ghost stood perfectly still, and for a moment they were back in that field 5 years ago, when he'd been young and free in hers. Then Ghost pulled away. He turned, walking toward the mine entrance, and the other iron horses fell in behind him, not in formation this time, but following because they chose to. Because somewhere in their modified brains, they recognized one of their own calling them home. Wait, Ruby called out. Ghost, please. Let me help you. We can remove the armor, try to reverse some of the modifications. Ghost looked back at her one last time. And in that look, Ruby understood. He didn't want to be fixed. Didn't want to return to captivity, even well-meaning captivity. He'd been made into a monster, and trying to unmake him would just be another form of control, another human deciding what he should be. Instead, he'd chosen freedom, damaged, painful, incomplete freedom. But his own. Ruby watched as Ghost led his broken herd out of the mine and into the snow beyond. They moved slowly, awkwardly, the armor weighing them down, their modified bodies struggling with autonomy after so long under control. But they moved together, choosing their own path. Should we follow them? Eli asked, helping Ash to his feet. The old gray horse was battered but alive, and he watched Ghost's departure with something that might have been understanding. No, Ruby said, tears streaming down her face. We let them go. Wherever they're heading, whatever they're looking for, it's theirs to find. The news broke 2 weeks later, spreading through newspapers across the Western Territories like wildfire. Headlines screamed about the Iron Brand scandal, detailed accounts of animal torture, military corruption, industrial conspiracy. The documents Ruby had recovered were damning, implicating army officers, government officials, and business magnates in a systematic program of cruelty. Silas Vance was dead, killed in what the official report called an industrial accident in an abandoned mine. Ruby and Eli had corroborated this story, omitting any mention of iron horses or Ghost's final rebellion. Some truths, they'd agreed, were too strange for anyone to believe. The public outcry was immediate and fierce. Congress launched investigations. Officers were court-martialed. Companies associated with the Iron Brand program saw their stock prices plummet. Within a month, every known modification facility had been shut down, and new laws were being drafted to protect animals from experimental procedures. But Ruby took no satisfaction in the victory. She knew the truth. They'd won a battle, not the war. Vance was dead, but his ideas lived on. Somewhere, someone else was probably already developing new variations on the Iron Brand concept, finding new ways to turn living things into machines. The world was changing faster than ethics could keep pace, and animals would always be the first casualties of human ambition. She'd returned to Clearwater Ridge, where Eli had offered her a permanent position as ranch manager. The old cowboy claimed he was getting too old to handle the work alone, though Ruby suspected he was just being kind. Either way, she'd accepted. She needed a place to heal, and so did Ash. The old gray horse had survived his wounds, though he'd never move quite right again. His injured leg gave him a permanent limp, and cold weather made him stiff. But he was alive, and more importantly, he was free. No one would ever brand him again. No one would ever try to break his spirit or modify his nature. Ruby had made sure of it by burning this CR brand off the ranch gate and replacing it with a simple sign. Clearwater Sanctuary. All beings welcome. No brands. No chains. No masters. Word spread quickly in the hidden networks of those who cared about such things. Within months, horses began arriving. Strays, rescues, animals that had escaped from abusive owners or been freed by sympathetic handlers. Some bore the marks of the Iron Brand program. Surgical scars, bolt holes where armor had been attached, the hollow eyes of creatures whose spirits had been broken and were slowly, painfully healing. Ruby took them all in. She had no illusions about fixing them. Some damage couldn't be undone. But she could give them a place to exist on their own terms, to make their own choices, to remember what it meant to be alive rather than useful. Ash became the sanctuary's unofficial guardian. Despite his age and injuries, he'd patrol the fence lines each evening, checking on the other horses, making sure everyone was safe. The newer arrivals seemed to sense his authority, and even the most traumatized horses would calm when he approached. It was as though he carried some essential knowledge, some hard-won wisdom about survival and dignity that he could communicate without words. Ruby had seen him stand for hours beside a shaking mare fresh from a modification facility, just being present, until her trembling finally stopped. He's like an old soldier, Eli observed one evening, watching Ash through the window. Seen too much, carries too many scars, but still keeps watch over the others. He's earned his rest, Ruby said. But I don't think he knows how to stop protecting. It's who he is. Maybe protecting is his rest, Eli suggested. Maybe after everything he's been through, this is peace, knowing he can keep others safe from what he endured. Ruby thought about that as she went out to check on the horses before bed. It was late autumn now, and the first snow of the season was beginning to fall. The mountains were white against a darkening sky, and the air had that crystalline quality that came before a hard freeze. She found Ash standing at the highest point of the pasture, looking north toward the Badlands. His breath created clouds of vapor in the cold air, and his ears were pricked forward, alert to something only he could sense. "What is it, old man?" Ruby asked, approaching quietly. "What do you hear?" Ash whinnied softly, and in the distance, Ruby heard an answering call. It was faint, almost lost in the wind, but unmistakable, another horse, calling across the darkness. She strained her eyes against the failing light and saw them, a line of dark shapes moving through the snow on the ridge above. Horses, 6 or 7 of them, moving in a loose formation that suggested purpose rather than wandering. And at their head, barely visible in the gathering dusk, was a massive black shape that could only be Ghost. Ruby's heart clenched. She'd thought about Ghost every day since that terrible morning in the mine. Wondered where he'd gone, how he'd survived, whether he'd found any peace in his damaged freedom. And now here he was, standing on the ridge above Clearwater Sanctuary, close enough to see, but too far away to reach. Ash called again, and Ghost answered. It was a conversation Ruby couldn't translate, but could feel. Acknowledgement, respect, perhaps even affection between two old warriors who'd survived when they should have died. Then Ghost turned, leading his herd away into the storm. Wait. Ruby started forward, but Eli's hand on her shoulder stopped her. Let him go, the old cowboy said gently. He knows where you are. He knows this place exists, but he's choosing his own path. He's injured. The armor, the modifications, he needs medical help. Maybe. Or maybe what he needs is to be free on his own terms, even if those terms mean pain. Eli squeezed her shoulder. You can't save everyone, Ruby. Sometimes the kindest thing is to let them choose their own ending. Ruby watched until the horses disappeared into the snow and darkness. Part of her ached to follow, to catch up with Ghost, and bring him back to safety. But another part, the part that had learned hard lessons about control and autonomy, understood that Eli was right. Ghost had made his choice. He'd rejected domestication, rejected human help, rejected everything except wild freedom with the few who understood what he'd endured. And who was she to deny him that, just because it scared her? Just because she wanted to fix what had been broken? Do you think he'll come back? She asked quietly. Maybe. If he needs to. Eli turned toward the cabin, limping slightly on his bad knee. Or maybe he won't. Either way, you've given him something important. What's that? A place to return to. If he chooses. The old cowboy smiled. That's all any of us can offer. A sanctuary when it's needed, and the freedom to leave when it's not. The winter was hard that year, the hardest Ruby could remember. Snow fell for weeks, burying the ranch under drifts that came up to the horses' chests. They lost 2 of the older rescues to the cold, and Ruby wept over their bodies before burying them on the hill overlooking the sanctuary. But the others survived. Fed on stored hay, sheltered in the barn during the worst storms, they made it through to spring. And when the snow finally melted and the grass began to green, there were new arrivals. 3 horses appeared at the fence line one morning, ragged, half-starved, bearing the telltale scars of iron brand modification. Ruby recognized them immediately as part of Ghost's herd, the ones who'd followed him out of the mine. They stood at the gate, not approaching but not leaving either, as though waiting for permission. You can come in, Ruby said softly, opening the gate. You're welcome here. All of you are always welcome. The horses entered slowly, warily, ready to bolt at any sudden movement. But Ash approached them, making soft sounds of greeting, and gradually they relaxed. By evening they were grazing peacefully with the other residents, their wounds being tended, their bodies beginning the long process of healing. Ghost himself never came. But throughout that spring and summer, more members of his herd appeared, always in small groups, always cautious, always bearing the marks of their terrible transformation. Some stayed permanently. Others rested for a few weeks before disappearing back into the wilderness, presumably to rejoin whatever remained of Ghost's band. Ruby never turned any of them away, and she never asked where Ghost was or what he was doing. She simply provided sanctuary for those who needed it and freedom for those who didn't. News of Clearwater Sanctuary spread, and with it came challenges. Ranchers complained that Ruby was harboring their property. The army demanded the return of horses that had been stolen from modification programs. Well-meaning activists insisted she should be doing more, documenting the abuse, testifying in courts, leading a crusade against animal cruelty. Ruby refused all of it. She'd fought her war and paid its price. Now she was done fighting. The sanctuary wasn't a statement or a protest. It was simply a place where damaged beings could exist without being used. You could do so much more, a reporter from Chicago told her during an interview. With your testimony, You could shut down every remaining modification program in the country. Or I could care for these 37 horses, Ruby replied, and let someone else fight the big battles. I'm tired of fighting. I just want to help the ones I can reach. The reporter had looked disappointed, as though Ruby had failed some moral obligation. But as Eli said later, helping one broken horse at a time wasn't glamorous enough for headlines. People wanted grand gestures, dramatic victories, crusades that changed the world. Ruby had learned that changing the world was impossible. But changing one life, giving one damaged creature a chance to heal, that was something she could do. So she did it, day after day, horse after horse. And Ash helped her, the old gray Mustang becoming a beacon for every traumatized animal that arrived. He seemed to understand their fear, their pain, their difficulty trusting humans again. He'd been through it himself, carried the scars to prove it. Sometimes Ruby would watch him standing with a newly arrived rescue, just being present, and she'd think about all the names he'd carried. The wild Mustang name his herd had given him. The brands burned into his hide by successive owners. The designation CR-47 he'd worn in the ranch's ledger before she'd changed it to simply Ash. All those identities imposed from outside. But who was he really? What name would he have chosen for himself, if horses could choose such things? She'd asked Eli once, and the old cowboy had laughed. Hell, Ruby, I don't think horses care about names the way we do. They know who they are. It's humans who need labels for everything. Maybe that was true. Maybe Ash didn't need a name, any more than he needed a brand or an owner or a purpose beyond simply being. Maybe just existing, walking his patrol each evening, standing guard over his adopted herd, growing old with dignity. Maybe that was enough. 3 years after the Iron Brand scandal broke, on a clear spring morning when the meadowlarks were singing and the aspens were just beginning to leaf out, Ruby woke to find Ash standing at the fence again, looking north. But this time he wasn't alone. Ghost stood on the ridge, massive and scarred, his iron armor glinting in the morning sun. The years had not been kind to him. He moved stiffly now, and one of his legs dragged slightly. The weight of the armor had taken its toll, fusing with bone and flesh in ways that could never be fully undone. But he was alive, still wild, still free, and he'd brought the rest of his herd, 11 horses, all bearing the marks of modification, all having survived years in the wilderness on their own terms. Ruby walked out slowly, not wanting to spook them. As she approached, she could see the extent of their injuries more clearly. Several were missing eyes. Others bore scars from surgery or bore armor that had partially fallen away, leaving raw wounds. One mare was missing half her jaw, probably from trying to bite through a metal restraint. They were broken things, all of them, damaged beyond repair. But they were together, and they were free, and they'd chosen to come here. Ghost descended from the ridge, moving carefully on his bad leg. He stopped 20 feet from the fence, close enough to see clearly, but far enough to run if needed. Ruby stood still, letting him look at her. She'd aged too. 3 years of hard work had left her leaner, harder, with new lines around her eyes and gray threading through her dark hair. She wondered if he recognized her, if he remembered anything about who they'd been to each other, before everything went wrong. Then Ghost took another step forward, and another, until he was standing at the fence, so close Ruby could have reached out and touched him. She didn't. She just stood there, letting him make the choice. Ash approached from the other side, whinnying softly. The 2 horses, one old and gray, one massive and armored, touched noses through the fence. It was a gesture of greeting, of recognition, of something that went deeper than words. You're welcome to stay, Ruby said quietly. All of you. There's food, water, shelter, medical care, if you'll accept it. No one will try to control you or use you. You can just be. Ghost looked at her with his remaining eye, and she thought she saw understanding there. But he made no move to enter the sanctuary. He simply stood at the fence, breathing the same air as Ash, existing in the same moment. Then he turned and walked back to his herd. They stood together on the ridge for a long moment, and Ruby understood. This was goodbye. Not temporary, but final. Ghost had come to show her that he'd survived, that her sacrifice and choices had meant something. But he wasn't coming back. His freedom meant more than safety. His autonomy meant more than comfort. And while he appreciated the sanctuary's existence, appreciated knowing there was one place in the world where modified horses could find refuge, he'd chosen a different path. Goodbye, ghost, Ruby whispered. Go well. Go free. The great black stallion turned one last time, and in that look was everything they'd been to each other, trainer and trained, human and horse, two beings who'd tried to bridge an impossible gap. They'd failed, in the end. The gap was too wide, the damage too deep. But they tried, and sometimes, Ruby thought, trying was enough. Ghost led his herd away, back into the Badlands, back to whatever life they'd carved out for themselves in the wilderness. Ruby watched until they disappeared into the distance, becoming specks, then shadows, then nothing. Ash stood beside her, and Ruby placed her hand on his neck. The old horse was thin now, his ribs showing through his coat despite good feed. He was failing, she knew. 26 years old, carrying scars from 3 different lives, worn down by time and trauma. But he was still here, still standing watch, still protecting his herd. Thank you, Ruby told him. For everything. For finding me when I needed finding. For showing me what matters. For being you. Ash turned to look at her, and his eyes were clear and calm. He knew, she realized. Horses always knew when the end was coming. They could feel it in their bones, read it in the turning of seasons, sense it in the way the world shifted around them. But he wasn't afraid. He'd lived long enough, suffered enough, fought enough. He'd earned his rest. That night, Ash lay down in his favorite spot, the highest point of the pasture, where he could see the entire sanctuary spread out below him. The other horses gathered around, forming a circle, standing vigil the way horses did for their dying. Ruby sat with him, her hand on his neck, feeling his breathing slow and deepen. Eli was there too, the old cowboy's weathered face wet with tears he wasn't ashamed to shed. You were a hell of a horse, Eli told Ash. Best I ever knew. And I've known a lot of horses. Ash's breathing hitched, steadied, then slowly stopped. His eyes closed, and the tension left his body. He simply went, peacefully, surrounded by those he'd protected, in a place he'd made safe through his own stubborn courage. Ruby wept, but there was peace in her grief. Ash had died free, unburdened by brand or bridle or human expectation. He died as himself, a wild Mustang who'd survived everything the world threw at him and still found the strength to protect others. They buried him on the hill, next to the others who'd found their final rest at Clearwater Sanctuary. Ruby carved a marker from local stone, and on it she wrote simply, Yes, H. He chose freedom. He gave sanctuary. He earned peace. And beneath that, in smaller letters, the best horses are the ones who remember their wild. 10 years passed. Ruby Shaw was 45 years old, gray-haired and weathered, her hands permanently calloused from ranch work. Clearwater Sanctuary had grown. 52 horses now called it home, along with a handful of cattle, some goats, and a donkey named Trouble who lived up to his name. She'd married Eli in a quiet ceremony with only the horses as witnesses. They'd built a new barn together, expanded the pastures, created a network of other sanctuaries across the West. The Iron Brand scandal had faded from headlines, replaced by new horrors, new controversies, but the work continued. Horses still needed refuge, still needed a place where they could exist without being useful. On a spring morning, exactly 10 years after Ash's death, Ruby woke before dawn and felt an inexplicable pull to ride north. She saddled Copper. Eli's old bay had proven remarkably long-lived, and headed into the Badlands alone. She rode for hours, following no path but instinct, until she reached a hidden canyon she'd never seen before. And there, in a sheltered valley with good grass and a spring-fed stream, she found them. Ghost's herd, or what remained of it. There were only 5 horses now, all elderly, all bearing the scars of their modifications. They grazed peacefully in the morning sun, and among them stood a massive black shape that could only be Ghost. He was ancient now, his armor corroded and partially fallen away, his movements slow and painful. But he was alive, still wild, still free. Ruby dismounted and approached on foot. Ghost raised his head, watching her with his one remaining eye. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, 2 old warriors who'd fought the same war from different sides. Then Ghost did something unexpected. He walked toward her. Slowly, painfully, but deliberately. He stopped just out of reach and lowered his head, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. Old friend, Ruby whispered. You're still here. Ghost's eye was cloudy with age, His breathing labored. She could see pneumonia or some other infection ravaging his lungs. He was dying, she realized. Had probably been dying for months, maybe years, but sheer stubborn will had kept him moving. The same will that had broken through iron brand conditioning. The same will that had chosen freedom over safety, pain over comfort, wild death over tame life. Do you want help? Ruby asked quietly. I could bring you back to the sanctuary, make you comfortable, ease your passing. Ghost stood motionless, and she had her answer. He'd chosen this place, this valley, this wild death among the few who understood him. He didn't want human intervention, even well-meaning intervention. He wanted to die as he'd lived, on his own terms. Ruby nodded, accepting his choice. Then I'll go? But I wanted you to know. She paused, struggling with words. I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. For everything. For bringing you into that world. For not protecting you better. For all of it. Ghost took one step closer, close enough now that she could touch him if she dared. His remaining eye was clear, and in it she saw something impossible, forgiveness. Or maybe not forgiveness, maybe just understanding. Maybe just the acknowledgement that they'd both done their best in an impossible situation. She reached out slowly, placed her hand on his scarred neck, felt the labored rise and fall of his breathing, the heat of fever burning through his body. He was so close to the end now, holding on through will alone. You were magnificent, Ruby told him. You still are, and you always will be, in my memory. The greatest horse I ever knew. Ghost stood there for another moment, accepting her touch, her words. Then he pulled away gently and walked back to his herd. The other 4 horses gathered around him, touching him with their noses, offering what comfort horses could offer. Ruby mounted Copper and rode away, tears streaming down her face. When she looked back from the canyon rim, Ghost was lying down, surrounded by his family, looking up at the sky with his one clear eye. She never saw him again. 20 years after the Iron Brand scandal, the Clearwater Sanctuary was the largest of its kind in the Western Territories. Over 100 horses called it home, along with various other animals who'd needed refuge from human cruelty or exploitation. Ruby Shaw was 65 years old, moving slower now, but still checking on each animal every evening. Eli had passed 5 years earlier, buried on the hill next to Ash and the others, his marker reading simply. He cared. New people had joined the sanctuary's staff. Younger people, idealistic and energetic, committed to the work. Ruby had begun training them to carry on after she was gone, though she hoped to have a few more good years left. On a cold December evening, as snow began to fall, Ruby walked the fence line one last time before bed. She was thinking about Ash, as she often did on winter nights. Remembering how he'd stood watch in all weather, protecting his adopted herd until the very end. She was so lost in memory that she almost didn't see the horse standing at the gate. It was young, maybe 3 years old, with a coat the color of storm clouds and a white blaze down its face that looked like a lightning strike. No brands, no scars, just a wild Mustang who'd somehow found its way to the sanctuary. Ruby approached slowly, and the young horse didn't run. It simply stood there, watching her with eyes that were startlingly familiar. Intelligent eyes, knowing eyes. Where did you come from? Ruby whispered, though she already knew. The Badlands. The wild country where Ghost had lived and died. This horse carried Ghost's bloodline in its build, its bearing, the particular way it held its head. And maybe, just maybe, it carried something of Ash too. The same defiant courage. The same protective instinct. The same fierce commitment to freedom. The young horse stamped its hoof once, twice. Then it turned and galloped into the darkness, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. But Ruby knew it would be back. Just like Ash had found her when she needed finding. This young horse would return when it was ready. And she'd be here, maintaining the sanctuary, keeping the gate open. For all the broken things. For all the wild things. For all the things that remembered freedom and refused to forget. She walked back to the cabin through falling snow, her heart full despite the ache of old losses. The world was still cruel. Animals were still exploited, abused, modified. The fight was never ending. But here, at Clearwater Sanctuary, there was refuge. There was healing. There was the simple, profound gift of being allowed to exist without being useful. And sometimes, on winter nights when the wind blew just right, Ruby thought she could hear them, Ash and Ghost, and all the others who'd died free. Not ghosts exactly, but echoes. reminders that resistance was possible, that dignity could be preserved, that even in a world determined to turn living things into machines, some spirits remained unbroken. She looked up at the sign above the gate, its letters worn by weather but still legible. Clearwater Sanctuary. All beings welcome. No brands. No chains. No masters. And beneath it, a new edition she'd carved herself just last month, in memory of those who chose freedom. The snow fell harder now, covering everything in white, making the world clean and new. Tomorrow there would be work, animals to feed, fences to mend, wounds to tend. The endless labor of mercy. But tonight, there was peace. The kind of peace that came from knowing you'd done what you could, saved who you could, given sanctuary when sanctuary was needed. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. And sometimes, Ruby had learned, something was all you could offer.